Margaret Whitmore sat at her own kitchen table and watched her son slide her cell phone into the breast pocket of his jacket, the way a man pockets his own keys without thinking about it. "It's just for a little while, Mom," David said. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the phone, making sure the pocket snapped shut. Across the table, Susan was holding Margaret's car keys in her palm, turning them over once, twice, the metal clicking softly against itself. The ring still had the little enamel loon Thomas had bought her at a gas station on Route 7 in 1988. Chipped now, the blue paint worn down to gray on one wing. "You scared us, Mom," Susan said, "in the Hannaford parking lot. You could have really hurt someone." "I clipped a shopping cart," Margaret said. "Nobody was hurt, not even the cart." Nobody answered that. There was a cardboard box on the counter by the toaster. Margaret had not packed it. She did not know yet exactly what was inside it. Only that it had appeared sometime that morning while she was in the bathroom, and that it was taped shut with the kind of packing tape that meant somebody intended to move it somewhere. Beside the box, face down, was a glossy brochure. She could see just the edge of it, a strip of green lawn, and a woman with white hair laughing at something outside the frame. Margaret did not need to turn it over to know what it was. She had seen the ones like it in Dr. Okafor's waiting room, tucked between magazines about retirement funds. "When do I get my keys back?" Margaret said. It was not really a question. 90 years of living had taught her the difference between a question you ask because you don't know the answer, and one you ask because you want to watch how the other person avoids it. "Let's not worry about that today," David said. "When do I get my phone back?" "We'll talk about it," Susan said, and dropped the car keys into her purse, and the small sound they made going in, a soft chime of metal against metal, muffled almost instantly by fabric, was the last Margaret would hear of them for some time. She did not raise her voice. She had never been a woman who raised her voice, not in 62 years of marriage, to a man who could go quiet for 3 days over a disagreement about lumber prices, not in 50 years of raising 2 children in a house with thin walls. She folded her hands on the table, the left one trembling slightly, the way it always did now, a small tremor she had learned to work around rather than fight, and she watched her son check his phone, his own, not hers, not yet, and text someone with his thumb. "Who are you writing to?" she asked. "Just Melissa," David said, letting her know we're on schedule. On schedule. Margaret turned that phrase over when Susan had turned the car keys, feeling its edges. On schedule for what? She had asked 3 days earlier straight out whether they were planning to move her somewhere, and David had told her with his hand resting briefly and heavily on her shoulder that nobody was moving anywhere, that they were only exploring options, that it never hurt to
I
look.
understand.
She looked at
A
the
risk
taped
to
box
understand,
again.
want to respect
"Whose
it.
clothes are in there?" she said. David glanced at it as though he had forgotten it was there, which she did not believe for 1 second. "Just some of Dad's old shirts. Susan thought Goodwill could use them. You haven't touched that closet in years, Mom." Margaret had touched that closet 3 days ago. She had stood in it with her hand against the flannel of Thomas's work shirt, the red and black one he wore the winter he wrote the portrait. And she had breathed it in the way she still did sometimes. understand you're trying to help," Margaret said. And she meant it, or she meant to mean it, because some very old part of her still believed that saying such things aloud might make them true and might soften whatever came next. But
I
it
would
was like
love
that telephone.
another spoonful
"We
of
already
sugar for
handled it,
this.
Mom," Susan said gently. And there it was, that word, and as if Margaret herself were a piece of paperwork that had been filed somewhere convenient. "You don't need to worry about any of it." Outside, the sky gone the color of wet slate, the kind of gray that rained one afternoon. Margaret looked past her children, out the window over the sink, at the maple Thomas had planted the year David was born, now 50 feet tall and dropping the first of its August leaves early because of the dry summer. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her, "They are not going to give either one back." That was the moment she understood it. Not the parking lot, not the phone call from Dr. Okafor's office asking why she'd missed her cardiology follow-up, which she had, in fact, forgotten, and which David had somehow found out about within a day, as though he had a wire tapped into her own doctor's office. Not even the box of Thomas's shirts. It was the flatness in Susan's voice, the practiced gentleness of it, a tone Margaret recognized because she had used it herself decades ago, soothing a toddler through a shot at the pediatrician's. "You don't need to worry about any of it." They were not asking her anymore. They were informing her. She was still turning that over, the specific, quiet horror of being informed about her own life. When she heard tires on the gravel outside, David heard it too. He straightened, looked toward the window, frowning the particular frown of a man who has scheduled every minute of a day and does not appreciate an unscheduled minute arriving uninvited. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked Margaret in the same voice he might have
I just
used
an
to
most
ask
to my
whether
decide.
she'd left the stove on. "No," Margaret said, and found, with some private satisfaction, that this at least was true. She was not expecting anyone. Nobody came anymore, not really, not since the girls from the church stopped their Tuesday visits, when Margaret's hearing made phone calls easier than conversation. She watched through the windows, dented along one flank, like trucks get when they fall wonderful, pulled to a stop at the end of the driveway, not blocking Susan's car, carefully. And a man climbed out into the rain that had just begun to fall, in the first fat, scattered drops. He was somewhere in his 40s, dark hair going gray at the temples, in the way men's hair does when they've spent a lot of years outside. He wore a canvas coat, unzipped, already darkening at the shoulders with rain, and he carried a leather document case under one arm, worn soft and pale at the corners, the way leather goes after 20 years of use, and in his other hand, wrapped in a scrap of gray cloth, something small enough to fit in his pocket. He came up the walk without hurry, the way a man walks when he has been planning this particular walk for a long time, and does not intend to let the weather rush him now that he is finally taken. David went to the door first. Margaret heard the exchange through the screen. David's voice, brisk, a little suspicious, asking if he could help him, and then the stranger's voice, lower, unhurried, asking a single question that stopped everything in the kitchen, cold. "Is this the home of Margaret Whitmore?" "Who's asking?" David said. "My name is Daniel Mercer," the man said. "I need to speak with Mrs. Whitmore, It concerns her husband, Thomas. There was a silence then, the kind that has a texture to it, and Margaret felt her own pulse pick up in a way it had not for the parking lot fender bender, had not for the phone call about the missed appointment, had not even for the sight of that taped cardboard box. She stood, more slowly than she would have liked, her knees announcing themselves the way they always did after sitting too long. And she walked to the door before either of her children could decide for her whether she wanted to. "I'm Margaret Whitmore," she said through the screen. The man on the porch looked at her, really looked, the way almost nobody looked at her anymore, not scanning her for signs of confusion or frailty, just looking the way you look at a person, and something in his face eased as though he had been carrying a question for a very long time and had just set part of its weight down. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "my name is Daniel Mercer. Your husband gave me your address a long time ago and asked me to come see you, but only if certain things happened first." He glanced briefly at David, at Susan standing now in the kitchen doorway with her purse still over her shoulder and Margaret's car keys still inside it, at the cardboard box visible past them on the counter. Something in his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, and then eased again. "I think those things may have started happening." "What things?" David said. "Look, I don't know who you are, but this isn't a great time." "I'd like to speak with your mother," Daniel said, still even, still unhurried, not raising his voice at all, which somehow made it land harder than if he had. "Alone, if she's willing. It's about a promise I made to her husband before he died." Rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the porch roof, running in a thin silver line off the gutter Thomas had hung himself in 1994. Margaret stood with her hand on the screen door latch, looking at this stranger who knew her husband's name, the way you know the name of somebody you loved, and she felt something she had not felt in longer than she could easily remember. She felt like a person other people were waiting to hear from. "Come in out of the rain, Mr. Mercer," she said, and opened the door. David did not want to leave the room, and said so, twice, in slightly different phrasings, the second time with his arms crossed over his chest, in the posture of a man guarding something. Daniel did not argue with him. He simply set the leather document case down on the kitchen table, unopened, and said, quietly, that whatever he had to say, he had been instructed by Thomas Whitmore to say to Margaret and to Margaret only, and that he intended to honor that, and that he would be glad to wait on the porch until she decided whether she wanted him to. "You don't get to decide who talks to my mother in her own house," David said. "No," Daniel agreed. "I don't. She does." And then he looked at Margaret and waited, the way almost nobody had waited for her opinion on anything in longer than she cared to count. And Margaret discovered that her voice, when she used it, still worked exactly the way it always had. "David, Susan," she said, "please give us the kitchen." They went, eventually, David with a long look back that Margaret recognized as the look he used to give her when he was 11 years old and being sent to his room for something he did not think he deserved to be sent to his room for. She heard them in the front hall, low voices, David's sharp and worried, Susan's softer, and then the screen door and the sound of David's car pulling partway down the driveway, not leaving, just far enough to be out of earshot, the engine idling in the rain like a held breath. Daniel sat across from her at the table where, 20 minutes earlier, her son had pocketed her phone. He did not open the document case right away. He set it on the table between them, and beside it gently he set down the object, wrapped in gray cloth. And for a moment he simply looked at his own hands, as if arranging what he meant to say. "I want to tell you first," he said, "that I'm not here to take anything from you. I know that might be hard to believe, given the day you've apparently had. I'm here because your husband asked me to be a long time ago, and because I think the reason he asked me to be has arrived." "What reason?" Margaret said. "Thomas used to say that someday people who loved you might mistake your age for the whole of you." Daniel's voice had gone careful. Like a man crossing thin ice he'd tested many times before, but never quite trusted, that you might get old enough that folks stopped seeing what you could still do and only saw what they were afraid you couldn't. He worried about that, not because he thought you were fragile, because he thought you were proud, and that your pride might make it hard for you to ask for help even when help was fair, and that other people's fear might make it easy for them to take more than help. He didn't want either of those things to happen to you without you having a say in it. Margaret sat very still. Outside, David's car idled on, the wipers ticking faintly through the rain. "He told me, near the end, that if a day ever came when people started making choices about your life instead of with you, when somebody took away the things that let you choose for yourself, I should come find you and bring you something and give you a choice back." Daniel looked at her then, steady. "I think today might be that day, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret's eyes went, without her quite deciding to send them there, to the small object still wrapped in gray cloth on the table. "What did you bring me?" she said. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he asked her a question of his own, gently, the way you might ask a question you already suspected the answer to, but needed to hear confirmed. "Do you still have a small brass key? Old, probably kept somewhere out of the way. A sewing box, a drawer, a tin. Your husband told me you kept it, even after you didn't remember what it opened." Margaret's hand went unconsciously to her chest, though there was nothing there but the collar of her blouse. She was thinking of a tin on her dresser upstairs, a cough-drop tin gone soft with rust at the seams, that held, among other things, she had never quite been able to throw away, a small brass key with a worn loop of string still knotted through its bow. "I have it," she said. Something in Daniel's shoulders came down, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders come down when a plan he has carried a long way finally touches ground. "Then I think it's time I told you a story," he said, "about a boy your husband hired in 1996 who nobody else wanted to hire. Millbrook, Vermont, sits in a fold of hills 40 minutes from the interstate, close enough to Silver Lake that on clear mornings you can smell the water before you see it. Margaret Whitmore had lived there her entire adult life, in the same white clapboard house on Cooper's Mill Road that she and Thomas bought in 1958, a year after their wedding, when Thomas was 25 and working as a hired hand for a cabinet maker in Rutland, and Margaret was 22 and keeping the books for her father's feed store, because nobody in Millbrook thought to hire a young woman for anything more complicated than that. She had married Thomas Whitmore on a Saturday in June of 1957 in the Congregational Church 2 miles from where she now sat, and she still remembered with a clarity that made some of last week's memories look thin by comparison the exact weight of the bouquet her mother had made from peonies cut that morning, still damp, still cool against her wrist. Thomas was not, by his own admission, an easy man to love in the ordinary sense. He was stubborn in ways that could take a full week to wear down. He would rather go without a new coat for 3 winters than spend money he considered unnecessary, and yet he would spend an entire Saturday, unpaid, fixing a widow's porch steps because he'd noticed them sagging on his way past. He argued with Margaret about money more times than either of them would have cared to count, particularly in the lean years of the late 1960s, when the workshop nearly folded and Margaret took in mending from 3 families in town just to keep the lights on. He forgot anniversaries with a consistency that had, by their 30th year, become almost a private joke between them, and neglected repairs at their own house, a loose railing, a sticking door, for months while he fixed other people's for free, which infuriated Margaret in a way she never fully stopped being infuriated by, even as she understood underneath the irritation exactly why he did it. He had opened Whitmore Woodworks and Repair in 1961 in a low tin-roofed building off Route 30 that had once been a dairy barn, doing cabinetry and furniture repair, and when times were thin, whatever paying work walked in the door. A broken porch step, a jammed window sash, a chair leg split by too many winters of dry heat. Margaret did the books from the kitchen table in a green ledger she filled out by hand in a script so neat that, decades later, an accountant reviewing it for the first time would ask, only half joking, whether it had been typeset. She knew every supplier by first name. She knew which customers paid on time and which needed a gentle reminder disguised as small talk, and she delivered those reminders herself, over the phone, in a voice so pleasant that nobody ever seemed to mind being asked twice for money they owed. When the recession hit in 1974 and orders for custom cabinetry dried up almost overnight, it was Margaret who suggested, over supper, that Thomas take in general repair work he'd been too proud to advertise for. Chair caning, window glazing, small engine repair for the neighbors' lawnmowers. Work that felt, to Thomas, like a step down from the fine joinery he'd trained his hands to do. Margaret did not argue him into it with speeches. She simply placed a small classified ad in the Millbrook Courier under his name, using money from the mending she'd been doing, and did not tell him until the first customer called. Thomas was furious for exactly 1 evening. Then the phone rang 3 more times that week, and by the following spring, Whitmore Woodworks and Repair had survived the recession that closed 2 other shops in the county. Thomas never once in the following 45 years forgot to say that his wife had saved his business. He said it to her privately, on their anniversary, most years. He did not say it to very many other people, not out of shame, but because he was not, fundamentally, a man given to public credit giving of any kind, for himself or anyone else. This was a fact Margaret had made a kind of peace with over the decades. that Thomas Whitmore helped people quietly, without ceremony, and that the town of Millbrook was full of small, unannounced kindnesses that had come from her husband's hands and her husband's wallet, and that she herself only ever learned about by accident at a funeral or a wedding, or standing in line at the post office when someone would mention, almost in passing, something Thomas had done for them 15 years earlier that he had never once brought up at their own supper table. She had never minded this exactly. She had resented it some years when the porch railing sagged for a second winter running, while Thomas rebuilt somebody else's chimney, flashing for free. But she had never doubted, not for one single day of their marriage, that underneath the stubbornness and the forgetfulness and the quiet, maddening generosity toward strangers, Thomas Whitmore loved her with the whole undivided attention of a man who did not waste words on things he considered obvious. He had a habit, in their early years, of talking to her about locks. It began, as far as Margaret could remember, sometime in the first year of the shop, when a customer brought in an old strong box with a broken latch and asked Thomas to fix it. Thomas had taken the mechanism apart at the kitchen table that evening, laying the pieces out on a folded dish towel, with the particular reverence he reserved for anything mechanical and old. And Margaret, doing the dishes, had asked him why a lock, of all things, seemed to interest him so much more than the cabinetry he was actually trained for. A lock isn't really about keeping people out, Thomas had said, without looking up from the little brass tumblers. Any fool with a crowbar can get through a door. A lock is about who gets to decide when it opens. That's all it ever really is. You can guard a thing with a wall, and anybody strong enough can knock the wall down. But a lock says somebody, specifically, gets to choose. That's worth more than the wall, if you ask me. She had not thought much of the remark at the time. It was the kind of thing Thomas said periodically, half to himself, while his hands were busy with something small and precise, and Margaret had learned over the years to let such comments pass through her the way a radio plays in another room, present, pleasant, not requiring a response. She would not remember it again, consciously, for nearly 60 years, but she would remember, decades later, the summer of 1958, the first summer of their marriage, when Thomas came home from an auction in Rutland with a small tin box of odds and ends he'd bought for $2 because he liked the look of the old hardware inside it. Hinges, a broken padlock, a scattering of keys of no particular value. Among them was a small brass key, its bow shaped like a simple oval, worn smooth on one face, as though it had once ridden in someone's pocket for years. "What does it open?" Margaret had asked him, turning it over in her palm on the porch that evening, the two of them still new enough to marriage that every small object felt like it deserved discussion. "Nothing, probably," Thomas said. "Lock's long gone, whatever it was, but I like the shape of it. Keep it if you want it." She had kept it, not because it opened anything. She agreed with him that it probably didn't, not anymore, if it ever had, but because he had given it to her, in the particular unhurried way Thomas gave things, without ceremony, without explanation, simply setting it into her hand and letting her decide what it was worth. Over the following 6 decades, it migrated from a jewelry box to a kitchen drawer, to, eventually, a rusted cough-drop tin on her dresser, where it sat among a handful of buttons and a hairpin and a St. Christopher medal that had belonged to her mother, an object of no apparent use that she nonetheless never once considered throwing away. She had not thought about the little brass key in years, not really thought about it, the way you don't think about a scar on the back of your hand until somebody asks how you got it, until the rainy August afternoon a stranger sat across her kitchen table and asked whether she still had it. "I was 15 the first time I met your husband," Daniel said. "It was the spring of 1996. I'd been picked up twice that year for breaking into cars along Route 30. Not for money, mostly. I didn't even know what I was after, just something to do that felt like it mattered, which is a stupid thing to say about breaking car windows. But I was 15, and my father had been gone 2 years, and my mother worked doubles at the diner in Rutland, and I didn't have a lot of people telling me what I was worth." He turned the small cloth-wrapped object slowly on the table as he spoke, not unwrapping it yet, just moving it a half-inch this way and that, the way a man handles something he's telling a story about before he's ready to show it. "A judge gave me a choice instead of a record. Work it off, some kind of supervised labor or juvenile detention. Nobody in town wanted to take on the kid who'd been popping car locks for kicks. Your husband did. I found out years later that he was the only name on the list of local business owners who said yes, without asking a single question about my file." Margaret sat very still, listening, her hands folded on the table, watching this stranger's face for the shape of her husband in it, the way you look for a person's reflection in water, even after they're gone. "First day, he didn't say a word about what I'd done, put a broom in my hand, and told me the shop floor didn't sweep itself. Second week, he showed me how to true up a chair leg on the lathe. Third month, he was letting me help with repairs customers actually paid for. He never once brought up the cars. Not that year, not any year after. I think I worked there almost 2 years before I understood he wasn't just being kind to me because a judge told him to. He kept me on after the court hours were done, paid me out of his own pocket some weeks when the shop barely covered it, though I didn't figure that out till much later either. Your name was in that ledger, the green one. I remember it on the shelf by the register. And I remember 1 week the number for my pay didn't match what the shop had taken in, and Thomas just closed the book like it was nothing. He never told me your name," Margaret said quietly. "Not once. He wasn't the kind to tell people what he'd done for somebody else," Daniel said, and there was something almost like a smile in it, sad around the edges. "He told me once. I was maybe 17. I'd made some crack about how he ought to put up a sign, Thomas Whitmore, second chances, something like that. And he told me helping people wasn't a thing you did to be known for it. Said, if you needed folks to know, it probably wasn't really about the person you were helping." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She could hear that sentence in Thomas's actual voice, could hear the exact cadence of it, the small pause before, know that he always put into a sentence when he was saying something he considered important, but did not want to sound important. "He got me through my GED that same year," Daniel went on, "drove me to the testing center in Rutland himself, sat in the parking lot the whole 4 hours, reading a newspaper because he said he wasn't going to have me walk out to an empty lot after doing something hard. Taught me joinery, taught me how to read a level, taught me, well, taught me most of what I know how to do with my hands, which is most of what's kept a roof over my own family's head. Since you have a family, Margaret said, and it came out gentler than she expected, some old instinct in her reaching automatically toward the ordinary kindness of asking. A wife, Carla, 2 kids, Miguel's 19, starting at the community college this fall, and Rosa's 15. Something crossed his face. Same age I was when your husband gave me that broom. What do you do now, Mr. Mercer? Mercer Restoration and Property Services, he said. Started it in 2009, mostly historic home restoration, some property management on the side, small outfit. 5 employees most of the year, 8 in summer. He hesitated. One of the properties I've maintained for almost 20 years now belongs, on paper, to a trust your husband set up. I didn't understand what that trust was really for until he explained it to me himself, near the end. I've kept my word to him every year since. I check the property. I make repairs. I've been waiting, Mrs. Whitmore, a long time, for a day I hoped would never actually come. He looked up at her then, and something in his face had gone careful again, bracing, as though he were about to hand her something heavier than the moment could easily hold. I think it's come now, he said. I saw your son take your phone before I even knocked. I saw the box in your kitchen. That's exactly the kind of day Thomas told me to watch for. Margaret looked down at her own folded hands, at the small tremor in the left one that never fully stopped anymore, and she thought of the word handled, and the sound the car keys had made going into Susan's purse, and she found that her eyes had gone hot and wet in a way she had not allowed them to, in front of anyone, since the week Thomas died. What exactly did my husband leave me, Mr. Mercer? She said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. I can't tell you everything today, Daniel said. Some of it I'm not even the right person to explain. There's an attorney, Thomas's original lawyer's partner now, who has documents I'm not qualified to walk you through myself. But I can tell you the shape of it. There's a piece of property. There's money set aside, enough that you'd never have to depend on anyone for a ride, or a doctor's visit, or a lawyer of your own, if it ever came to that. And there's a decision only you get to make, because Thomas built it that way on purpose. Not me, not your children. You! He unwrapped, finally, the small object he'd carried in, folding back the gray cloth to reveal a second brass key, nearly identical to the one Margaret kept upstairs in a rusted cough-drop tin, except that this one was newer, brighter, the metal, not yet worn by decades of handling, and stamped along its shank in letters so small Margaret had to lean forward to read them, were 3 words. For the choosing. He had this cut the year he got sick, Daniel said quietly. Told me it wasn't the original key. Said the original lock had been changed years before you two even met, and the key you'd kept all this time didn't actually open anything at all. Not anymore, not by itself. But he said the idea of it still opened something if you understood what it was for. This one's a copy of a lock that does still exist. He wanted you to have it, but only if you asked to have it. He was very particular about that part. He said, and I'm about as close to his exact words as I can get after all these years. He said a key somebody else hands you and tells you to use isn't a gift. It's an order with nicer wrapping. He wanted this to be a question, not an instruction. Margaret reached out slowly and took the new key from his open palm. It was cool and heavier than it looked, and the letters under her thumb felt sharp enough that she could read them by touch alone, the way she used to read the coins in the church collection plate, by feel in the dark of an evening service. "What is the question?" she said. Daniel Mercer looked at her the way she would think much later. Almost nobody had looked at her in years, as though her answer genuinely mattered, and had not already been decided for her by somebody else in another room. "Do you want to know what your husband spent the last 9 years of his life quietly building for you?" he said, even though you never asked him to. Outside, through the rain-streaked window, Margaret could see David's car still idling at the end of the driveway, and beyond it, the maple tree Thomas had planted the year their son was born, its leaves turning early and dark green against a sky the color of wet slate. And she thought of 62 years of marriage, and a green ledger, and a boy with a broom and a phone in her son's breast pocket, and she closed her hand around the new brass key until its stamped letters pressed a small, clean line into her palm. "Yes," Margaret Whitmore said, "I would. Before going further, I want to ask you something. Think for a moment about an older person in your own life, a mother, a father, a grandparent, a neighbor, someone who taught you how to do something or told you something true when you needed to hear it, and who maybe somewhere along the way started getting treated like their age was the only thing left to know about them. Write their first name in the comments below, or just a line about what they gave you. It costs nothing, and it might mean more than you think to somebody scrolling past. And if stories about people whose worth gets quietly written off deserve to be told properly, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, because there's a great deal more of Margaret's story still to come. Now, back to that kitchen table, and the rain still coming down on Cooper's Mill Road. David did not leave the driveway. He sat in his idling car for 11 minutes. Margaret would later find out it was exactly 11 minutes, because Susan told her apologetically weeks afterward, before he came back up the porch steps and let himself in through the screen door without knocking. The way he had let himself into that house his whole life, the way a son does when he has not yet learned that his mother's home is not, in fact, an extension of his own authority. "Time's up," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway, rain darkening the shoulders of his jacket. "Mom, we've got the intake appointment at Fairhaven at 2. We need to get moving." It was the first time Margaret had heard the name of the place spoken aloud in her own house. Fairhaven. She had seen it, small and gold embossed, at the top of the brochure that had been lying face down on her counter that morning, and some part of her, the part that had done the books for a struggling shop for 45 years and never once missed an unbalanced column, filed the word away and did not forget it. "I never agreed to any appointment," Margaret said. "We talked about this, Mom, weeks ago." "You talked about it," Margaret said, I said I would think about it. Those are different sentences, David. Daniel had risen from his chair, unhurried, and stood a little apart from the table, the leather document case still closed beside the two brass keys. The old one Margaret had gone upstairs to retrieve while David idled outside, and the new one still resting in her palm. "Who is this guy again?" David said, turning on Daniel with the particular sharpness of a man who has been made to feel, for the first time in weeks, that he is not entirely in control of a room. "You said something about my father. What exactly does that mean?" "It means your father asked me to look after certain arrangements for your mother," Daniel said, calm, not stepping back an inch. "Arrangements she has every legal right to know about, and to act on herself without needing your permission or mine." "What arrangements? What is he talking about, Mom?" Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, the way she had looked at Daniel Mercer on the porch, the way almost nobody had bothered to look at her lately. And she saw underneath the sharpness something that had been there since he was a boy of 9 or 10, standing in this same kitchen, worried about something he did not yet have the words for. She loved him. That had never once, in 64 years, stopped being true. It did not make what he had done to her these past 3 weeks any less true either. "I am going to find out," Margaret said, "and when I understand it myself, I will decide what I want to tell you, not before." "Mom, this isn't a game. You have an appointment." "I have an appointment I did not make, at a facility I did not choose, that I am not going to. You can't just—" "David." Margaret's voice did not rise, but something in it changed. Some register she had not used with her son since he was 17 and had wanted to drop out of Millbrook High to work construction, and Thomas had used exactly this tone on him then, once, and it had worked. "I raised you, I do not answer to you." The kitchen went very quiet. Rain ticked against the window glass. Somewhere down the hall, the old clock Thomas had repaired 3 times over the decades struck the half-hour, a soft, familiar chime that had marked half-hours in that house for 68 years. David's jaw worked for a moment, and then he turned and walked out. And this time, the screen door slammed hard enough to rattle in its frame, and a moment later, his car pulled out of the driveway, too fast, gravel spitting under the tires, and was gone down Cooper's Mill Road toward town. Susan lingered in the doorway a moment longer. She looked, Margaret thought, less angry than her brother, and more uncertain, the look of a woman doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to. "Mom," she said finally, "I really did think this was the right thing. I want you to know that." "I believe you thought that," Margaret said, and it was, in fact, the truth. "I would still like my telephone back, Susan." Susan hesitated, glanced at Daniel, glanced at the 2 brass keys on the table, and for a moment Margaret thought she might actually reach into her purse and hand over the car keys too. She did not, but she took a slower breath than she had all day, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch, and she said quietly, "I'll talk to David," before she followed her brother out into the rain. When the house was quiet again, Daniel opened the leather document case and drew out a plain white envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed with a strip of clear tape that had gone brittle and amber with age. Margaret's own name was written across the front in Thomas's hand, the particular slant of his capital E, the way he always crossed his T's with a short, decisive stroke, a hand she would have known blind by feel alone if someone had pressed the paper into her palm in a dark room. He wrote this the year he was diagnosed, Daniel said. Sealed it himself. Told me not to open it, not to read it, not even to guess at what was in it. Told me only to bring it to you, if the day ever came that I've described. I've carried it in that case for 7 years, Mrs. Whitmore. I want you to know I never once broke that seal. Margaret's hands trembled, more than their ordinary tremor now, as she worked her thumbnail under the old tape. It came away in dry, brittle strips. Inside was a single folded sheet of the yellow legal paper Thomas had always kept a pad of on his workbench for measurements and cutting lists and the occasional grocery item he was asked to pick up on his way home. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I was right to worry, and I'm sorry for that, because I always hoped I was wrong. I hope whoever the children have brought in to take care of business hasn't taken care of you instead. You always hated being managed. I remember you telling off that insurance man in 1979 for talking to me instead of you about our own house. You were right then, and I expect you're right now. I want you to know something I should have told you plainly a long time ago, instead of leaving it for a letter. The shop only survived 74 because of you. I know I said it before, on our anniversaries, but I don't think I ever said it loud enough, or often enough, or in front of enough people, and I'm sorry for that too. Every good thing I ever managed to do for anybody else in this town, I could only afford to do because you kept the books straight and never once let me bankrupt us being kind to strangers, even when you had every right to stop me. I started putting this together in 2011 after the Pearson place came up for sale at the tax auction, the little cottage on Silver Lake you always slowed the car down to look at when we drove that road. Daniel and I have been fixing it up ever since, on the quiet, a little at a time, the way we used to fix up other people's houses. It isn't finished. I ran out of years before I ran out of work to do on it. I'm sorry about that, too. I wanted to hand it to you whole. There's a lawyer, Walter Higgins, or his partner now if Walter's finally retired, like he kept threatening to. Everything's on file with them. There's enough set aside that you will never have to ask David or Susan for a ride, or $1, or permission, as long as you live, if you don't want to. But Margaret, and this is the only part of this I need you to really hear, none of it means anything unless you're the one who decides to use it. I didn't build a way for somebody else to take care of you. I built a way for you to keep taking care of yourself, the way you always have, whether anybody else noticed or not. A lock only means something because somebody decides when it opens. I told you that once, a long time ago, fixing a stranger's strongbox at our own kitchen table, and I don't think you were listening very hard because you were 22, and I imagine you had better things on your mind than an old man's opinions about hardware. I've thought about it more since than I ever expected to. I built you a lock, Margaret. The choosing is yours. It always was. I love you. I always did. Even on the weeks I forgot to say it, or fixed somebody else's porch before I fixed ours. Thomas Margaret read it twice through, and then a third time, more slowly, her thumb resting on the last line as though she could feel the pressure of the pen through the paper, and when she finally looked up, Daniel Mercer had turned his face toward the rain-streaked window to give her what privacy a small kitchen could offer. "He never told me about the Pearson place," she said, when she trusted her voice again. "I always did love that cottage. We used to drive the lake road on Sunday afternoons when the children were small, and I'd ask him to slow down going past it, just to look. He knew that," Daniel said quietly. "He told me that's exactly why he bought it." Margaret folded the letter carefully along its original creases and pressed it flat against the table for a moment, the way she might press a hand against something warm. "I would like to see it," she said. "The cottage, today, if that's possible." Daniel glanced at the window, at the rain still coming down, steady and gray, over Cooper's Mill Road, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "Thomas never once let a little weather stop him from finishing a job," he said. "I don't see why we should start now." The drive to Silver Lake took 18 minutes in Daniel's truck, out past the Congregational Church where Margaret had been married, past the Hannaford where the fender bender that started all of this had happened 3 weeks earlier, out along the lake road where the trees opened up every quarter mile or so to show gray water under a grayer sky. Margaret sat with her hands folded around the 2 brass keys in her lap, the old worn one and the new stamped one, and watched the familiar road go by like something she was seeing for the first time in years, though she had driven it or been driven along it more times than she could count. "There," she said, when the cottage came into view, and she said it the way you say the name of somebody you have not seen in a long time, but would know anywhere. It was small, smaller even than she remembered from all those slowed-down Sunday drives decades earlier. A single-story clapboard cottage with a steep roof and a stone chimney set back from the road behind a stand of birch that had grown up thick and unruly in the years since anyone had properly tended the property. The paint was fresh on the shutters, she noticed, newer than the rest, and there was a wheelchair-width ramp built discreetly along one side of the porch steps. The wood weathered just enough to look intentional rather than new, and Margaret understood, looking at it, that somebody had been thinking a very long time ahead. "Before we go in, I want to ask you something, because I think it matters more than it might seem. What do you think Thomas actually left behind in that cottage? Was it money? Was it something Margaret would come to value even more than that? Say what you think in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know before we find out together. And if you want to see exactly what a quiet, careful man spent 9 years building for the wife he loved, go ahead and hit subscribe and like the video, because we are about to open that door. The old brass key, the one Margaret had kept for 68 years in a rusted cough-drop tin, did not fit the lock on the cottage door. She had not really expected it to. Daniel had told her as much, and Thomas's letter had said the same. But there was something in trying it anyway, in feeling the key refused to turn, that felt necessary, like closing a very old chapter before opening a new one. It was the new key, the one stamped for the choosing, that slid into the lock smooth as oil and turned with a small, solid click that Margaret felt travel up through her wrist. Inside, The cottage smelled of cedar and dust, and, underneath that, faintly, of sawdust that had not yet had decades to fully settle into a house, and Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment before she could make herself walk any farther in. There was a workbench along one wall, built low and sturdy the way Thomas built everything, with pencil marks still visible on the wood where he had measured something and never rubbed the mark away. There was a thermos dented at the base, sitting exactly where somebody had left it on a shelf, as though its owner had only stepped out for a moment and meant to come back for it. There was a chair in the corner, a rocking chair, its caning half finished. The pattern started on one side and simply stopped, a spool of caning cord still looped over one arm. And Margaret understood, without being told, that it had been meant for her, and that Thomas had run out of time before he could finish it. On the wall above the workbench hung a calendar, curled and sun-faded, turned to March of 2019. Margaret did not need Daniel to tell her that Thomas had died that April. He worked out here most Saturdays those last few years, Daniel said quietly, standing in the doorway behind her. Told your children he was fishing. I think he even brought a rod along most days, so it wouldn't be a total lie if anybody asked. Margaret laughed, a short, surprised sound that came out half a sob, because it was exactly the kind of thing Thomas would do, exactly the kind of small, careful dishonesty that let him keep a promise to himself without ever quite lying to his family, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and stood very still in the doorway of the cottage her husband had spent the last years of his life quietly restoring for her, 20 minutes from the house where she had raised his children without her ever once suspecting. There was more to see, and Daniel showed her patiently, room by room, a small kitchen, updated with the kind of grab bars and lever handles that spoke of a man who had thought carefully about what his wife might need at 90, though he had never lived to see her reach it. A bedroom with good light, a bathroom with a walk-in shower, tiled by hand, the grout lines straight as anything Thomas had ever built in his own shop. And in a locked cabinet, in what had clearly once been meant as a study, a fireproof document box, and inside it, folders, receipts going back to 2011, correspondence with a law office in Rutland, bank statements from an account Margaret had never known existed, a ledger in Daniel's handwriting recording every hour and every dollar spent on the restoration over 9 careful years. There's an attorney's number on the front of that folder, Daniel said. Renee Alvarez. She took over Walter Higgins's practice when he retired in 2021, but she's had this file since before that, going back to when your husband first set it up. I've already told her this morning that I might be calling. If you're willing, I think it would help for you to hear all of this confirmed by somebody who isn't me and who has no stake in it at all. Margaret looked around the small, unfinished cottage her husband had built her in secret, at the rocking chair with its half-finished caning, at the pencil marks on the workbench that were, in their own way, as much a letter as the one folded now in her cardigan pocket. And she nodded. Call her, she said. I want to hear it in my own name, from somebody who has no reason to lie to me. Renee Alvarez had a calm, unhurried telephone voice that put Margaret in mind, oddly, of Thomas himself, though she had never heard the man's voice before that afternoon. She confirmed, over the speaker of Daniel's phone, set on the workbench between them, that yes, she held the complete file for a trust established by Thomas Whitmore, beginning in 2011, that the trust's sole beneficiary and sole decision-making authority was Margaret Whitmore, that neither David nor Susan Whitmore held any legal standing over its assets, and that the trust held, in addition to the cottage property, a sum of money. Renee named a figure that made Margaret sit down slowly in the one finished chair in the room, set aside specifically for Margaret's independent use, transportation, in-home assistance, medical evaluation, and legal counsel of her own choosing, should she ever need any of it. "I want to be very clear about something, Mrs. Whitmore," Renee said, her voice steady over the phone's small speaker. "This trust doesn't give Mr. Mercer or me or anyone else any authority over your decisions. It exists to protect your authority over your own decisions, specifically against the possibility that someone else might try to exercise it for you. Your husband was extremely deliberate about that structure. He consulted with me at length about it. He wanted to make absolutely certain that nothing he built could ever become another version of the exact problem he was trying to protect you from. And if my children contest it," Margaret said, "if they say I'm not competent to decide any of this." There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of paper shifting. "That's a fair question, and I'd encourage you to get ahead of it rather than wait for it," Renee said. "I can arrange an independent cognitive and capacity evaluation through a geriatric specialist in Burlington I've worked with many times, someone with no connection to your family, your children, or to me. It's a straightforward, respectful process, not the kind of thing people sometimes imagine when they hear the word evaluation. Given what you've described about the missed appointment and the parking lot incident, I'd actually recommend it regardless, not because I doubt you for one moment, but because a clean, independent record protects you far better than my say-so or Mr. Mercer's ever could, if anyone tries to argue otherwise later." Margaret turned that over, some old stubborn part of her, the part that had refused, for 3 weeks, to admit she needed reading glasses in 1985, until Thomas finally hid her sewing, until she agreed to get them checked, wanted to refuse outright, to insist there was nothing to evaluate. But she thought of the letter in her cardigan pocket, of the line about her own pride, and she made herself sit with the discomfort a moment longer instead of pushing it away. "Arrange it," she said. "I would rather know the truth of myself from somebody with no reason to flatter me either way." The evaluation, conducted 8 days later by a geriatric neuropsychologist named Dr. Priya Suresh in a quiet office in Burlington, took just under 3 hours and involved no surprises Margaret could not have predicted herself. Her memory for recent events showed some of the ordinary slowing expected at 90. She occasionally needed a moment to retrieve a name, forgot, once, the day of the week before catching herself. Her judgment, her reasoning, her understanding of her own financial and legal affairs, and her capacity to make and communicate decisions were, in Dr. Suresh's own written words, entirely intact, consistent with normal cognitive aging, and showing no signs of dementia or impaired decision-making capacity. I want to say one more thing. Off the record of this report, Dr. Suresh told her at the end of the session, not unkindly. Needing help with some things doesn't mean losing the right to decide anything. I see families get that backwards constantly. They confuse a person's need for support with a person's inability to choose, and those aren't the same thing at all. You may well decide someday that you'd rather not drive, or that you'd like someone checking in on you more regularly. That would be a wise decision made by a capable person. It would not be the same thing as somebody else making that decision for you. Margaret thought of David placing her phone in his breast pocket, and Susan dropping her car keys into a purse with a soft chime of metal. And she thought that Dr. Suresh had, in one plain sentence spoken in a quiet Burlington office, said the exact thing she had not had the words for herself 3 weeks earlier, sitting at her own kitchen table. The weeks that had led to that kitchen table, the ones before Daniel Mercer ever knocked on her door, had not arrived all at once. Margaret understood this clearly now, looking back on it with the report from Dr. Suresh, in a folder on the cottage's finished workbench, and a phone of her own. A new one, purchased with trust funds and set up patiently by a young clerk at the Rutland Mall, who did not once talk to Daniel instead of her, ringing in her cardigan pocket for the first time in 3 weeks. It had started small, the way these things always did. In late June, after she'd clipped a shopping cart backing out of a space at the Hannaford, a fender bender no worse than 100 she'd had in 70 years of driving, causing no injury and less than $400 of damage to a plastic cart corral. David had suggested gently that maybe it was time to think about whether she should still be driving at night. Margaret had agreed, actually, that night driving had become harder on her eyes, and had said so. Within a week, maybe think about night driving had quietly become David, checking her mileage on the odometer each Sunday when he came for supper. Within 2 weeks, Susan had begun helping with the mail, sorting it before Margaret saw it, and a bill from the propane company had gone unpaid for 11 days because Susan had set it aside to look into, a delay that had never once happened in the 68 years Margaret had managed her own household budget. When Margaret missed her cardiology follow-up in July, a genuine mistake. She had simply misremembered the date, the kind of small error she'd made her whole life and always caught within days. David had somehow known about it within 24 hours, and Margaret later learned, with a small cold shock, that Susan had asked the receptionist directly to call David if Margaret ever missed or rescheduled an appointment, without asking Margaret first. Then had come the conversation about the bank in early August, framed as pure convenience, David suggesting he be added to her checking account just in case, so bills could be paid if she was ever in the hospital. And Margaret, tired that particular evening, not thinking clearly enough to ask why a temporary hospital stay required permanent access, had signed a form David placed in front of her without reading every line as carefully as she should have. It was the one decision, looking back, that she genuinely regretted, not because David had yet done anything dishonest with the access, but because she had let exhaustion make a choice her clear-headed self would have questioned. By the middle of August, David had contacted Fairhaven Senior Living without telling her at all, scheduling what the brochure called an informational visit, which somehow became, in the space of 10 days, an intake appointment with a deposit already discussed. Susan, meanwhile, had quietly reached out to a realtor named Kip Donnelly about what a house like Mom's might be worth in this market, a conversation Margaret would not learn about until much later, and one Susan herself had not fully processed the meaning of until she heard herself repeating Kip's estimate to David over the phone one evening, and realized, with the particular vertigo of hearing your own voice say something you had not quite let yourself think, that she was talking about selling her mother's house while her mother was still very much alive and living in it. None of it, taken in a single piece, had looked like theft. That was what made it so effective and, so quietly, devastating. It looked, at every individual step, like care. Margaret understood now, sitting in the cottage that smelled of cedar and old sawdust, that this was exactly the mechanism Thomas had feared and tried, 9 careful years in advance, to build a door out of. Not one dramatic betrayal, 100 small, reasonable-sounding ones, each easy to justify on its own, each one closing a little more of the room around her until the day David placed her phone in his breast pocket and she finally understood, all at once, how far the walls had already come in. It was Susan, in the end, who told Margaret about the money. She came to the house on Cooper's Mill Road alone, 10 days after the rainy afternoon Daniel Mercer first knocked on the door on a Tuesday evening when she knew David had his softball league and would not be dropping by unannounced. She knocked this time, which Margaret noted, and waited on the porch until Margaret came to let her in, which Margaret noted too. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," Susan said, sitting at the kitchen table where, weeks earlier, she had dropped her mother's car keys into her purse. She looked tired in a way Margaret recognized from Susan's own childhood, the specific exhaustion of a person carrying something they had not fully admitted to themselves they were carrying. "I talked to Kip Donnelly, the realtor, back in July." "I know," Margaret said. "Daniel's attorney found the inquiry in some records she pulled together. She thought I should know." Susan flinched slightly, but did not deny it. "David asked me to. He said it was just to have a number in case we ever needed one. I didn't think that much about it at the time. I should have." "Why now?" Margaret said. "Why tell me tonight?" Susan was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee mug slowly on the table, the way her mother had turned brass keys over in her palm weeks earlier. "David's in trouble, Mom. Real trouble. Not the kind he wanted you to know about." She took a breath. 3 years ago, he put almost everything he and Melissa had into a commercial property deal in Rutland, a strip mall renovation, something a guy from his softball league talked him into. It fell apart almost immediately. He's been carrying close to $140,000 in debt and back taxes ever since, and he hasn't told anyone except me, and I don't think he's even told Melissa the full number. Margaret sat with that for a moment. She thought of David's face 3 weeks earlier, saying we're on schedule, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some difficult mixture of both. He convinced himself the house sale was practical, Susan went on, that you'd eventually need care anyway, that Fairhaven was actually a nice place, that selling now instead of later was just being efficient, that none of it was really about the money, even though the money was, I think, the whole reason he moved as fast as he did. I don't think he ever let himself say that plainly, not even to me. But I started noticing things. The way he talked about the house's value before he ever mentioned your comfort. The way he scheduled the Fairhaven appointment before he'd actually asked you if you wanted to go. I heard Daniel ask you, straight out, whether you wanted him to stay that first day, and I realized none of us had asked you a single direct question in 3 weeks. We'd just been talking about you, never to you. And now, Margaret said, now, I don't know how to fix what I let happen, Susan said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I'm not asking you to forgive either of us tonight. I just didn't want to keep being part of something I finally understood was wrong. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand, the left one, trembling slightly as it always did now, over her daughter's, and left it there a moment before she spoke. I love you, Susan, she said. That was never in question. But loving somebody and trusting them with my whole life are 2 different sentences. Same as the ones I told your brother. You're going to have to earn the second one back, not with an apology, with time, and with asking before you decide. Susan nodded, wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, and did not argue, which Margaret thought, privately, was itself the beginning of the asking. By September, the balance of power in Margaret Whitmore's life had turned all the way around, quietly, the way a tide turns, not with a single dramatic wave, but with the slow, steady withdrawal of water from ground it had covered for weeks. She had her own phone now, a simple one with large buttons that she had chosen herself at the Rutland Mall, and she answered it herself every time in the same pleasant, unhurried voice she had once used to remind Whitmore Woodworks customers about overdue invoices. She had a car of her own again, too, not the sedan David had disabled by quietly unplugging the battery weeks earlier, which she left parked exactly where it was. A small, silent monument to the whole affair, but a newer one, purchased through the trust, that she drove herself in daylight to the places she still wanted to drive to, and arranged a driving service through an agency Renee Alvarez recommended for evenings and longer trips, a decision Margaret made entirely on her own, without anyone suggesting it to her first. She had her own attorney's number in her new phone's contacts, saved under Renee's actual name rather than any euphemism, and she had a folder of her own kept in the cottage's fireproof box, holding a signed and notarized copy of Dr. Suresh's evaluation, which she did not need to show anyone, but which she found herself glad to have all the same, the way a person is glad to have insurance they hope never to use. She did not shout about any of it. If anything, David would remark later, in a rare unguarded moment, that his mother had never seemed calmer in his entire life than she did that September, and that the calm was somehow far harder to sit across a table from than any amount of anger would have been. Anger David could have argued with. Margaret's quiet, steady certainty left him nothing to push against at all. He came to the house on Cooper's Mill Road on the 2nd Sunday of September, the way he always had, though this time he called first to ask if it was a good time, a small courtesy that had never once occurred to him 3 weeks earlier, and that Margaret noted without comment. Susan came with him, sitting a little apart, closer to Margaret's end of the table than to her brother's, a placement Margaret also noted. "I want to talk about the house," David said, once they were seated, and Margaret could see him trying to find his old footing, the brisk, managing tone he had used all summer and failing to quite locate it. About everything, really. Mom, I know you're upset." "I'm not upset, David," Margaret said. "I was upset 3 weeks ago, sitting at this table, watching you take my phone. I've moved a good deal past upset since then. Look, I made mistakes. I know that. But you have to understand where I was coming from." "I understand exactly where you were coming from," Margaret said, and she said it without heat, which seemed to unsettle him more than shouting would have. "You have $140,000 of debt you didn't tell your own wife about, and somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that selling this house early wasn't really about the money, even though it was. I'm not asking you to explain that to me. Susan already did." David's eyes flicked to his sister, something wounded and betrayed moving across his face, and Susan held his gaze without flinching, which Margaret thought was the bravest thing she had watched her daughter do in a very long time. "I'm going to ask you a few questions, David," Margaret said, "and I'd like you to actually answer them instead of explaining them." He nodded, jaw tight. "Why did you take my phone?" I thought it would be simpler. Fewer scam calls. Fewer things for you to keep track of." "Why did you call the realtor before you asked me a single question about whether I wanted to sell this house?" He was quiet a moment. "Because I'd already decided it made sense," he admitted finally. And something in his own voice seemed to surprise him, hearing it said aloud. "I told myself I was being efficient." "And why?" Margaret said. "Did you decide that a woman needing a little help getting groceries in from the car meant that woman no longer got a voice in her own life?" David did not answer that one right away. Margaret let the silence sit. She had learned over 62 years with Thomas that silence sometimes did more work than any sentence could, and she let it do that work now, watching her son sit with a question he had clearly never once allowed himself to ask honestly. "I don't know," he said finally, quietly. "I think I got scared, and it was easier to take over than to sit with being scared. And somewhere in there, I think I started believing that because I was scared for you, I had the right to decide things for you, which isn't the same thing. I see that now. I didn't then." It was, Margaret thought, the most honest sentence her son had spoken to her in a month, possibly longer. "I do need some help, David," she said. "I'm 90. My knees hurt most mornings. I don't see as well at night as I did at 70. I may someday soon decide I don't want to drive much at all anymore. None of that is a secret, and none of it frightens me the way it seems to frighten you. What I will not accept from you or from anyone is having those decisions made about me instead of with me. There's a difference between a daughter or a son who helps and one who takes over. You crossed that line, David, more than once, and you did it without ever once asking me where it was." She told him then, plainly, what would happen next, because Thomas's arrangement had given her, for the first time in weeks, the standing to say it and mean it. David's name would come off her checking account by the end of the week, Renee Alvarez was already preparing the paperwork. Any bill or piece of mail he had redirected would be returned to Margaret's own address, effective immediately. He would have no role in any future medical or housing decision on her behalf, ever, under any circumstances. A boundary Margaret had asked Renee to put in writing, notarized, filed with her doctor's office and with Fairhaven both, so that no well-meaning receptionist could ever again call her son before calling her. The car he had disabled would be repaired at his expense and returned to Margaret's driveway, whether or not she chose to drive it, because the point was never the car. The point was that it belonged to her, and the choice of what to do with it did too. "You took money out of that account, David," Margaret said. $600 in July for what Renee's records call moving expenses. I don't believe I ever agreed to move anywhere in July. David's face went pale. "I was going to pay it back." "You'll pay it back," Margaret said, "by the 15th. Not because I need the money, but because you need to understand that taking something without asking is taking something, no matter what you tell yourself while you're doing it." "And after that," David said, and his voice had gone smaller than Margaret had heard it since he was a boy. Are you going to want to see me at all?" Margaret considered the question honestly, because he had, for once, asked her one directly, and she thought he deserved the same in return. "I love you," she said. "That has not changed and is not going to change. But love and trust are not the same account, David, and you cannot make a withdrawal from one to cover what you owe the other. You'll come to supper when you're invited. You'll ask before you assume. And it may take a good while before I invite you, as often as I once did, and that will not be punishment. It will simply be the truth of where we are." Susan's path in the weeks that followed proved different, and Margaret made sure it was different, deliberately, because the difference mattered, and she wanted both her children to see that it mattered. Susan had come to her on her own before being confronted, had told the truth about the realtor and about David's debt without being asked, had begun that autumn, doing something she had never quite managed before, calling ahead, asking rather than assuming, sitting in Margaret's kitchen and listening more than she spoke. It did not erase what Susan had done, but Margaret found herself trusting her daughter's hands with small things again, a ride to church, a shared grocery list, an actual conversation about what Margaret wanted, rather than a decision announced after the fact, sooner and more easily than she trusted her son with anything at all. And she told Susan plainly why, so that the lesson was not left to guesswork. "You corrected course while you still had the chance to?" Margaret told her, one October afternoon, the two of them shelling late-season peas at the kitchen table, the way they had done together 30 years earlier, when Susan was still a girl who told her mother everything. That matters more than people think. It doesn't erase what came before it. But it's not nothing, Susan. It's not nothing at all. It was Margaret herself, in late October, who finally made the decision about driving. Not David, not Susan, not Dr. Suresh, and not the empty passenger seat of a car that had sat disabled in her driveway for a summer. She had driven herself to the pharmacy on a gray Thursday afternoon, along a stretch of Route 30 she had driven 10,000 times in 70 years, and had found coming home in the early dusk, that the oncoming headlights bloomed and smeared in her vision in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of her and everything to do with the plain, ordinary fact of being 90 years old. She had pulled into her own driveway a little too fast, her heart going harder than it should have, and had sat for a long moment with her hands on the wheel before she went inside. That evening she called the driving service Renee had arranged and told them she would like a regular arrangement for evenings and for longer trips. Starting the following week, she kept the car. She drove it herself in daylight, to church, to the market, down the lake road on clear Sunday afternoons, when she wanted to slow down and look at the cottage the way she once had, decades earlier, with Thomas in the driver's seat and two small children asleep in the back. But the evening driving, the driving that frightened her, she let go of on her own timeline, in her own words, to a service she herself had chosen and was paying for, out of a trust her own husband had built specifically, so that this decision would always, always belong to her. She hung the old brass key, the one that no longer opened anything, the one Thomas had bought for $2 at an auction in 1958 and given to her without ceremony on a porch in the first summer of their marriage, on a small hook by her own front door, where the newer key, the one stamped for the choosing, hung beside it. Visitors sometimes asked about the two keys, hanging there together, a matched, unmatched pair, one dulled with 68 years of handling and one still bright. One's for remembering, Margaret told them when they asked, and one's for deciding. I like to keep both close. It's easy to forget you still have the second one. Once people start telling you, you've only got the first. The cottage at Silver Lake was finished, at last, the following spring, though not quite in the shape Thomas had originally begun it. Margaret and Daniel worked out the rest of it together over the winter, sitting at the same workbench, where Thomas's pencil marks still showed faintly under a fresh coat of varnish, and what they arrived at was something neither of them could have built alone, and something Margaret came to believe Thomas would have liked far better than the private retirement cottage he had first imagined. It became, by the following June, a small residence, 4 modest bedrooms finished off in the space Thomas had roughed in, a shared kitchen, a sitting room looking out over the lake, meant to house a few at a time. Older people navigating exactly the kind of crisis Margaret herself had lived through that August, a sudden loss of independence, a family conflict over care, a widowhood nobody had prepared them for, a season when they needed somewhere steady to stand while they figured out, with real support and without anyone taking the deciding away from them, what came next. Margaret named it simply the Whitmore House and put a small brass plaque by the door. Not gold embossed, not glossy, nothing at all like the Fairhaven brochure that had once lain face down on her kitchen counter, that read only "Built by Thomas Whitmore," finished by his wife. The old barn workshop behind the cottage, which Thomas had never gotten to in his 9 years of quiet Saturday work, became something else again, a small teaching shop, where Daniel, some Saturdays, brought young people from the county who needed exactly what Thomas had once given a 15-year-old with a habit of breaking car windows, a broom a task, and one adult willing to believe they were worth the trouble before they'd proven it. Daniel called it, with Margaret's blessing, Whitmore's second chance, and the first apprentice through its doors. That autumn was a 16-year-old named Marcus, who had been 2 court appearances away from a very different kind of future, and who, by November, could true up a chair leg on the lathe as steady as Daniel himself had, 30 years earlier, in a tin-roofed shop off Route 30. Daniel came by the Whitmore house most weeks that first year, sometimes for repairs, sometimes for nothing at all, beyond a cup of coffee and a half-hour of conversation, and Margaret came, in time, to think of him less as a stranger who had appeared in the rain with a leather document case, and more as something closer to the sun-shaped space Thomas had quietly built into their family without ever quite telling her. He never once tried to take Thomas's place, and Margaret never once needed him to. His job, he told her once, sitting on the cottage porch on a warm evening with the lake going gold at the edges, had never really been to rescue her. Thomas used to say a man's job isn't to open somebody else's door for them, Daniel said. It's to make sure the door's still there and still theirs whenever they're ready to open it themselves. That sounds like something he'd say, Margaret agreed, and did not tell Daniel that it also sounded unmistakably like something Thomas had said to her a very long time ago at a kitchen table about a broken strongbox and a lock and a boy she had not yet met. Susan came around most Sundays that first year and always knocked now, even on days she knew Margaret was expecting her, a small habit that had become, without either of them ever discussing it directly, a kind of ongoing apology neither of them needed to put into words. She helped Margaret plant a fall garden at the Whitmore house in October, asking each time, before she reached for a tool or moved a bag of soil, whether that was where Margaret wanted it. And Margaret found, more often than not, that she genuinely did want her daughter's help, now that it arrived as an offer instead of an announcement. David's road back was slower, and Margaret let it be slow on purpose. He repaid the $600 by the 15th of September, as promised, and then, over the following year, worked steadily and without complaint at repaying the far larger debt he had finally admitted to his wife, taking on extra contracting jobs, most weekends, $140,000, whittled down, slowly, honestly, the way Thomas had once whittled down a recession with a classified ad and a wife who refused to let his pride sink his business. He came to supper perhaps once a month that first year, always by invitation, always careful now to ask rather than assume. And Margaret watched him patiently, without rushing either of them toward a forgiveness that had not yet been fully earned. Margaret's grandchildren, David's 2 and Susan's 1, had absorbed over that difficult summer a simplified version of events. That Grandma had gotten confused, that things had gotten complicated, that it was better not to ask too many questions. And it took most of a year for the fuller truth to reach them, in pieces, mostly from Susan, who told it more honestly to her own son than she had ever managed to tell herself in real time. David's younger daughter, Emma, 19 and sharp-eyed, was the one who finally asked Margaret directly, over Thanksgiving supper the following year, what had actually happened that August, and Margaret told her plainly, without softening any of it, and watched her granddaughter's face change as she understood for the first time, that the grandmother she had been quietly instructed to worry about had, in fact, spent that entire autumn calmly and completely rebuilding her own life on her own terms. "I want to be like that when I'm 90, Emma said, and Margaret laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had not laughed easily in the weeks before Daniel Mercer knocked on her door. "You can be like that a good deal sooner than 90, if you want to," Margaret told her. "Nobody has to wait until they're old to start deciding things for themselves. I'd have saved myself a great deal of trouble if I'd remembered that a little more loudly, a little more often along the way." By the following August, a full year after the rain and the taped cardboard box and a phone disappearing into her son's breast pocket, Margaret Whitmore's days had settled into a rhythm that looked, on the surface, almost exactly like the days before any of it happened, and felt, underneath, entirely different. She still moved slowly some mornings. Her knees still hurt more often than not, and worse in wet weather. Her left hand still trembled over her morning coffee, and she had, in fact, decided the previous winter that she no longer wanted the bother of driving after dark at all. A decision that had cost her nothing to make, because it had been entirely hers to make. She forgot a name now and then, and let herself forget it, without panic, and remembered it 20 minutes later, the way she always, eventually did. She answered her own phone most mornings, sitting at her own kitchen table, and opened her own mail with a little brass letter opener Daniel had made for her the previous Christmas, and chose, most Thursdays, whether Susan would drive her to the market or whether she'd rather take herself. Daniel came by the cottage most weeks to fix whatever the lake weather had loosened since the last visit, and some Saturdays a 16-year-old named Marcus came with him, learning to true up a chair leg on the same lathe Thomas had once taught a different troubled boy to use, 30 years and one long, difficult August apart. Susan knocked before she came in. David called ahead and came when invited, and was, slowly, more often invited than not. The old brass key and the new one still hung together on their hook by the door, close enough that they sometimes touched, a small faint chime of metal against metal that Margaret had come to like the sound of, in a way she never quite had, when the sound had belonged to somebody else's hand closing around her keys instead of her own. She thought, some evenings, sitting on the cottage porch with the lake going quiet and gold, about the difference between being cared for and being controlled, a difference she had lived through rather than simply understood, and one she did not believe could be taught any other way. She did not think families were wrong to worry. She had watched her own children's fear that August, and some of it, underneath everything else, had been real fear, born of real love, however badly it had gone about expressing itself. Aging was not without its dangers, and she did not pretend otherwise, to herself or to anyone who asked. But she had come to believe, with the particular certainty of a woman who had spent 90 years paying close attention, that protection stopped being protection the exact moment it stopped asking permission, and that the whole of a person's dignity at any age lived in that one small, ordinary word. So here is what I want to ask you before we close this one out. Do you think Margaret was right to draw the hard lines she drew with her own children, even knowing how much they loved her and how much some of their fear was real? How should a family weigh a parent's safety against a parent's right to keep choosing for themselves? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, so leave it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because there are more stories like Margaret's still to tell. People the world quietly stopped listening to, who turned out to have a great deal left to say. Margaret Whitmore kept 2 brass keys on a hook by her door for the rest of her life. One no longer opened anything at all, and never really had. The other opened a door she had chosen herself to walk through. She liked, in the end, to think that was exactly the way Thomas had meant it. That a lock was never really about keeping anyone out. It was about who got to decide when it opened. And, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, that person was, once again, simply her.